Hi there. Hope your week's going well. It's good to be with you this middle of the week. Glad we're staying connected. Glad we're continuing to do some Bible study and try to keep our spirits sharp as we try to keep our body safe. Going through a lot of changes, and it's interesting how the ripple effect of changes, how suddenly a lot of things begin to change. Saw a cartoon just a couple of days ago about there was a fellow was walking out in a parking lot toward his car, and caught in the back of his pants and draping behind him was about 4 or 5 feet of toilet paper. I guess everybody's kind of fear is to walk through the mall with toilet paper out your shoe or things like that. But rather than the caption ridiculing him, the caption said, "Doesn't it just frustrate you when people flaunt their wealth?" Now, 4, 5, 6, 7 weeks ago, that wouldn't have made any sense at all. Now we all understand what that means. Saw another cartoon that some professional gamblers sitting around a table had their visors on and their sunglasses so you couldn't see their eyes, and they all had a mask on. And the caption said, "Narrator speaks in hushed tones, says, and Jimmy ups the ante by pushing forward to the middle of the table 2 rolls of toilet paper and 1 bottle of hand sanitizer." It just really illustrates how sometimes when things change, the impact of that and how what becomes valuable almost overnight based on the changes in demand. About 6 or 7 years ago, seems like I was in Broken Bow, Oklahoma on a weekend, doing a weekend retreat, and it was a marriage and family type thing. And we had probably 6 or 7 sessions between Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And on Saturday morning, I took one of the sessions and was just talking about divorce recovery. And after it was over, one of the elders from the congregation that was hosting the retreat came up to me. We were talking during the break, and he said, "You really don't need to talk about that much here because we're a unique congregation. Divorce really is not an issue here." And after he said that, I got to thinking to myself, well, if that's the case, then we can move on to other things. There's all kinds of things to discuss and all kinds of things to address. But I said, just to myself, just to be sure, at the beginning of the next session, I asked, and there were probably 70, 80 people there, and I asked, just so I understand who I'm talking to, if your family or extended family has not experienced a divorce of someone in that group, would you raise your hand? And only about 5 hands went up, which meant the rest of them, somewhere in their family or extended family, somebody they were close to had experienced a divorce. The elder that had spoken to me, obviously his jaw was on the floor. And it kind of illustrates a point that one of the challenges, and to be honest with you, I think it made him a little bit uncomfortable that I broached the subject. And that's important to our discussion. But he was surprised. And he was surprised because obviously there was not a lot to talk about it. I was kind of the one that dealt with the elephant in the room, so to speak, or began to introduce that. The title of this lesson today is, "In Christ and with You, I Can Conquer Divorce." Now, that raises some issues that I want to address because we don't think of divorce as something that needs to be conquered, but I believe it is, and I believe Scripture is going to help us with that. But first, what I want you to understand is part of human nature, and I think especially a part of American culture is, we're not very good at preparing for the future, and that's obvious in what's going on with stimulus money and all of that. We don't expect to have to lay aside in savings to prepare for not being able to work for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. Now, our parents or our parents' parents would have done that because they'd come through the Depression and they didn't trust being able to have a job and all of those kinds of things. And we've got into a situation where we really don't kind of prepare for the future. We're not real good in discipline in that way. We kind of change the battery on the car when the car won't start. We tend to be crisis changers. And that becomes a real issue, because that means that we're not going to make improvements in our lives until we have a crisis. Are you like me when you go by cemeteries, a place like that, and you see elderly folks out there walking? Does it occur to you, I wonder which one of them had the heart attack? Because the tendency is someone that age, if they're out trying to be healthy, it's because they've got a health issue that they're trying to deal with. In other words, they're responding to a crisis. Because we're inundated with so many things, in our culture, we're not really interested in something unless it impacts us directly. And even then, we're not really interested until it becomes a crisis. One of the things about so many of these illnesses, unknown illnesses, is when somebody experiences it, or experiences somebody in their family that has ALS, something like that, they don't know anything about it. Then, now that it's impacting me, I want to learn everything about it that I can. Then I want to pursue ALS awareness. I want everybody else to be aware. The problem is, they don't have as much, they probably have as much interest in being aware of ALS as you were before you got it, or someone that you love got it. And this is the case with divorce. It's something that we don't tend to deal with or talk about until we're in the crisis. And that's a tough time. It's hard to try to batten down the hatches when the tornado is over the house. If you're not prepared, then and I've gone through this with a lot of people. And as any minister can tell you, it's kind of like when you do weddings. Here's a couple that has never been married before, and you counsel with them. And one of the things I do in premarital counseling is we spend a whole session just walking through what the wedding ceremony is going to be. And I try to recommend some things because I've seen so many people go through, and it's become such a tense day and all of those kinds of things. But you can see it in their eyes. And then you prepare them for it, and then you walk through, and they walk right into that same crisis, etc. If you've not been touched by divorce yet, you will. Someone in your family or extended family is going to bring it to your doorstep. No one predicts their own divorce until it's imminent. A lot of people don't predict their own divorce until they find out their partner's having an affair, or they're served divorce papers. That's the two big wake-up calls. So we're talking about denial or being unaware or whatever until we're right in the middle of it. And then the carpet's pulled out from under me, and I am trying to, you talk about a crisis. And there's some aspects about divorce that make us having a discussion very, very difficult. And part of that's theological. I'll get to that in a moment. But I want you to know divorce is the second most devastating event in human experience, second only to death itself. And they're actually quite similar because it both involve an ultimate loss. There's a loss of a loved one in death, and there's a loss of a loved one in divorce. In some ways, death is more painful to endure when you lose someone that way. In some ways, losing a person through divorce is more difficult. Each of them has its own difficulties, but one of the challenges in the loss of divorce, and I tell everybody who goes through it, you're going to have to grieve your marriage just like you would grieve the loss of someone. It's work that needs to be done. A marriage has died here. And that marriage almost has a personhood of its own. Death of a marriage, when it's grieved, the challenge with it is the loved one's still around. When we have a funeral, one of the things about a funeral is that word you've heard a lot, closure. We're able to say goodbye. We're able to, and that's why I think sometimes even graveside ceremonies are important, is because we actually see this casket with our loved one, and we see it at this place where it's going to go into the ground. And it's not out of sight, out of mind. It really is. It really makes it real. And that's why you see all new sets of tears at funerals, things like that. But one of the benefits of that is that's what begins the grieving process and getting to closure. But it's difficult to do that when you're suffering the loss of a partner and that partner's still around. It's kind of like having the cadaver of the marriage that we can never bury. In a sense, almost have to take it with us everywhere we go. Grief is work that must be accomplished. Most people don't know how to do it, and that's why counseling can be very helpful, because there are steps to grief. There are things that need to be done. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. See, it's a walk that we have to take. But again, if it's just crisis, then we have to set the course when we're in the valley. And I'm going to make some proposals at the end of this video about how to kind of interrupt that, how to kind of prepare us for dealing with folks, or to dealing with if, God forbid, we should have to go through that process. But one of the things that we don't do when someone loses a loved one to death is we don't isolate them. We don't say, all right, we're going to leave you alone and give you time just so you can mourn by yourself. We surround them. But folks who go through a divorce, a loss of a loved one, often feel isolated. Now, the reason for the isolation is often folks don't know what to do, and especially in the church. And that's why divorce has become kind of a taboo subject. And that's what came up in Broken Bow, is you had an elder who just really was living in this illusion that it's not an issue. Obviously, they weren't talking about it as a family, as a congregation, so there was just this elephant in the room that they didn't talk about. So it becomes taboo. We don't discuss it. Now, there's a reason for that, and I think it's very important. And the first has to do with, there are two aspects of divorce that have to be dealt with. One is the theology, and the other is just the psychology, the emotional part. And certainly spirit is all in that, but most of us, because we have never been able to solve the issue of the theology, we don't know, we stay in neutral. We don't know what to do. That's why we don't, if someone gets divorced, especially in the church, are they a guilty party? Are they an innocent party? Do they have grounds for divorce and all of that? And guys, we have never, as a brotherhood, we've never solved that thing. In fact, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of discussion of divorce. There was a lot of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. There were so many books. There were so many lectureships about that. And one of the things that we determined is we're never going to agree on this. But we kind of agreed to disagree. And part of that agreement to disagree is we just don't talk about the subject. Because if we talk about it, it's going to lead us into the theology. And since we've never solved, and I would venture to guess that here at Fort Gibson, there are people who would see someone as an innocent party that someone else sees as a guilty party, quote unquote. Now understand, those are not biblical terms. These are terms that we've created. But there are folks who would say, well, this person doesn't have a right to divorce. And someone else would say, well, that person has a right to divorce, et cetera, et cetera. So now what you have is a disagreement. We can't talk about that. Because if we talk about that, it'll bring division. And one of the things that happened during all of the discussions, a whole decade plus of marriage, divorce, and remarriage, was division. I heard debates. Going back to when I was in graduate school, there were debates. And I remember the room would get tense in the debate because the people who were debating were very adamant about what they believed, as rightly they should. But what came across was kind of a, I don't accept your stance, so I have trouble accepting you. And I think in our minds, in order to deal with the psychology, we've got to deal with the theology first. And what I want us to look at is not to set that aside, but to give it its proper place. In order to deal with someone who is in divorce, in order to deal with someone who has gone through a divorce, in order to deal with someone who is having issues about a divorce in their past, in order to be able to minister to them, we have to feel like that's okay. That's accepted by God for us to do that. But again, the problem comes is we feel first we have to judge their right to have a divorce. We feel like we have to judge their their right to ministry, if you will, their right to being encouraged or lifted up or prayed for or whatever, we've got to decide that. So we've got to decide, do you have grounds for divorce? Are you a guilty party? Are you an innocent party? Et cetera, et cetera. And since we have trouble determining that, then we don't know what to do. And so when we don't know what to do, we tend to not do anything. So divorce is not talked about. And I'm not talking about the theology of it. Now, if we need to have a class on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, by all means, let's do that. But one of the things that I want us to discuss is how to minister to folks who are either in the situation, have gone through the situation, or in the aftermath of the situation and have adjustment issues or things like that. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. John wrote, "My little children, I'm writing these things to you that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous." I love this passage, but it presents a challenge because John clearly states, I write these things so that you don't sin. Now, if you sin, now wait a minute, you said you wrote these things so that we don't. Yes, that's the ideal. That's the standard. That's the desire. What's the reality? If you do sin, you've got an advocate with the Father. Illustration I would use about that to get us to understand it is, let's say that I'm a dad and I've got a 10-year-old son, and the rest of the family's gone, and I've got to leave, run to the store, get bread or whatever, and I tell the 10-year-old, I want you to stay in the yard. Now, stay in the yard means, do you see where these boundaries are in our yard? You need to stay in the yard. Now, if you leave the yard, I'm going to punish you. But if you leave the yard, know this: you have an advocate with your father, and that's your mother. Did it just sound like I gave him permission to get out of the yard? Does it sound like that when I said, don't leave the yard, that I then just went back on that and said, all right, now if you do? You see, one of the things that we confuse is accepting the reality of what people do versus justifying what people do. And I mean, that's what John is doing. The ideal, the hope, the purpose of his writing is that we don't sin. The reality is that we do. Now, does he say, I write these things that you don't sin, but go ahead? No. Did he justify sin? No. What he wanted us to understand is that when we do sin, because that's human nature, our lives aren't done. We're not outcasts. We're not headed to hell then. There's more to it. It's the permission to sin versus the reality of sin. According to John, there are people who choose to sin. You're one of them, I'm one of them. And he's told us, I write these things so you don't sin. But you're going to, and I'm going to. And so the question is, all right, I sinned. What now? I remember when Travis was about 8 years old. I was telling him about something I wanted him to do or not do, and I don't remember what it was. And his response was, well, what if I do? What if I do what you don't want me to do? Or what if I don't do what you want me to do? And I told him what the consequences would be. And I watched the gears in his head move as he was weighing the cost versus the benefit of doing what he wanted to do. In other words, he was trying to figure out, should I go ahead and do this anyway and bear the consequences? Or because of the consequences, should I not do this? So sometimes we all do what we know is wrong, even though we understand it's wrong and we understand there are consequences to doing it. But we confuse the reality of choice with the acceptability of the choice. One of the things I run into often with counseling is, and we do this a lot theologically, you can't do that. For instance, let's take an extreme. You can't murder someone. Well, sure you can. Now, is it acceptable to God to murder someone? No. But can I do it? Yes. And sometimes we exclude our choices by not acknowledging them as choices. So God commanded us, don't commit murder. But what if I do? Or God commanded us, don't commit murder, and now here I am standing over the dead body of someone I murdered. Now what? And the now what does not justify the behavior. It's just God's way of dealing with us when we've made a mess. Now that I've done it, what do? I write this so that you don't sin. But if you do, you see, he's not giving permission. He's acknowledging human nature. And he's answering the question, now what? Okay? And the good news is we have an advocate. So what that does, on either side of this guilty party, innocent party, or whatever, we have a now what situation. We've got folks that we've counseled with them, please don't get a divorce. We've tried to help them with conflict management, all of those kinds of things. And here they are coming out of the courthouse with signed and notarized, divorce papers. Now what? And guys, we can't sometimes get to the now what because we're still trying to figure out they can't do that. Now wait a minute, they did. Jesus said, if a man divorces his wife for any reason, stop just a minute. If a man divorces his wife, notice Jesus didn't say, if a man divorces his wife, now we understand in God's eyes they're not really divorced, all of those kinds of things. Jesus is calling them divorced. He's not giving them permission to do that. He's just acknowledging human nature and that divorce is part of our lives. So what do? My first computer, I got it in 1990. The purpose for the computer, me, was writing papers for college because I was very bad at typing, so I got a computer so I could correct everything. First thing I did, and this was 1990. I mean, this ran off DOS 3.1, way before Windows and all of those kinds of things. Got the thing, set it up, got it mail order. There was nowhere around that you could buy one. You had to buy them through the mail. This one came from California. It was $1,000. 16 hertz, not gigahertz, megahertz, 16 hertz speed. Had a 10 megabyte hard drive, $1,000. And first thing I did, I didn't know what I'm doing. And I'm one of those, I'm going to get in here and try this, try that, whatever. That's how I learn. And I read the manual when I mess up, and that's what happened here. But somehow I deleted my config sys file, which is the file that tells the computer what to do when it first starts up. So everything was fine until I shut the computer down. When I tried to start it back up, they didn't know what to do. It didn't know anything. So I had to call California, and I called the guy in the service department and said, just got this computer, and somehow I have erased its memory of what to do when he starts up. And I got a lecture about, you don't do that. Don't erase the exact back file. Don't erase the config sys file. I know that. I'm an advocate of that. Now, my question to you is, what do I do? Because back then they didn't ship a DOS disk with it or anything like that because, you had to use those old floppy disks. And it was a frustrating discussion because he's trying to give me a lecture to not do what I've already done. Problem is, it doesn't do me any good at this point. Now, what do I do? So, in the question, how do I deal with this divorce? How do I deal with the spiritual consequences of someone's divorce? What I want you to know is we're tempted to shun somebody, to personally disfellowship somebody. If there's a quote-unquote guilty party, I shouldn't talk to this person. I shouldn't because they can't do this. And the truth is they can and they did. The question is, now what? And we don't acknowledge that people have choices and they make choices when we say, well, you can't do that. And what we really mean is you shouldn't choose that. I've gone through this in counseling when people feel like they're victimized. They feel like I'm in a place in my life where I have no choices. And when you start talking about choices, have you ever thought about running away? Have you ever thought about quitting your job, leaving your family, etc. Well, I could never do that. Yes, you can do that. But when you say, I won't do that, that's very empowering. You just made a very powerful choice. So the truth is, people do get divorced. And then we don't know how to react. Or we feel like we have to judge their situation. We have to decide, is this somebody who's an innocent party that I can offer solace to, that I can offer support to? Because I don't want to offer support to someone who's guilty, because then I'm maybe getting in trouble with God himself. What I want you to understand is this idea of disfellowshipping someone or isolating from someone is not an individual thing. That's a real body thing. In Matthew chapter 18, if your brother sins, go and reprove him in private. If he listens to you, you've won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. And if he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be as you, a Gentile and a tax gatherer. Guys, this thing is a church thing. Now, in our situation, that involves elders. What I want you to understand is this whole theology issue is not for you and me to judge. That's a shepherd issue. So when somebody's in a divorce situation, it's up to them to decide and to come to us and say, all right, this person has committed sin, and the sin has led to divorce, and they're not repenting of it. So now we need to practice withdrawal of fellowship, withholding of fellowship to this person. Now we know clearly what the response is. That's not an individual choice to be made. According to Matthew 18, it's a church thing. So here's my recommendation to you is, unless you hear otherwise from your shepherds, minister to people who are hurting as a result of divorce. Our shepherds will determine who is spiritually acceptable to God and who's not spiritually acceptable to God, because that's their responsibility, okay? That's why this sin issue, they get involved in it, no matter what it is, in divorce or otherwise, any sin. So that way we can separate the theology of divorce from the psychology of the divorce. Because regardless of what the theology is, you got hurting people. Now, you may have a hurting people whose soul is in jeopardy, and you may have a hurting person who's fine with the Lord, but they're having to deal with negative emotions and all kinds of things, all kinds of traps that Satan can put them in order to try to destroy them. And if we're not helping these folks, then Satan can end up getting them all. And I've seen him do that. There was a deacon in the church in Chickasha once, and I went to him, and he and his first wife had divorced and married a very beautiful lady, etc. And I asked him once, would you teach our junior high school class about the reality of divorce? And his response was, nothing I'd love more, but I can't do it. I said, why not? And he said, because their parents wouldn't accept it. Their parents would go nuts. And I was saying, but kids need to hear what it's really like to get a divorce, because we don't talk about that in our culture. See, our culture is so pro-divorce and so pro-freedom that we don't talk about negative consequences, because we want everybody to be free. And if you're in a situation you don't like, you're free to leave and all of that. Everybody that leaves a marriage walks through a door into something else, and we don't talk about that. And what he was saying was, I don't feel comfortable trying to help young people, and he knew the pain. He knew things that they never could think of the consequences of divorce, because he had lived it every day, and how much he could have helped them. Now understand, this is going to change. Understand, this is going to change. Understand, once you're divorced, you're never going to have a 50th wedding anniversary with just the kids that you and your wife had. That's out. And on and on and on. Things that you never think about. And we have a culture of no-fault divorce. So one of the things we do in this culture, we don't talk about the negative consequence. Oh, we say it's painful. We say it's a horrible process, but we don't talk about the cost of divorce and the aftermath of divorce. So what happens is folks don't learn how to address it, and they ended up taking the baggage from their first marriage into the next marriage, and it just compounds. That's why in Christ and with you, we can conquer divorce. Divorce doesn't have to destroy people. The first thing I want you to know is if you have experienced a divorce, you're not alone and you're not evil. You're divorced. You may have sinned. Your partner may have sinned. Both of you may have sinned. And it may be that commission of adultery, abandonment, all kinds of things. It could be attitudes, all kinds of things. But you need support. You need for us to be willing to talk with you without judging the theology involved. Just talk to you. I'm not talking about the theology of divorce. And that's what, when we have a class of divorce, it becomes marriage, divorce, and remarriage. And we're trying to figure out who's acceptable, who's not. The problem is, you got a hurting Christian. And if we exclude them that way, there's a great chance we're going to lose them. And folks, we have lost so many people to divorce without even considering whether they're guilty or innocent. You need to know that we understand. We need to understand. The denial of divorce just continues the devastation, and it becomes a cycle. God hates divorce because it goes against his nature, but so does all sin. But remember, God hates divorce, not you. God hates divorce because it hurts everyone involved and everyone touched by it, and it has a ripple effect, and it touches so many. God hates divorce because that ripple effect involves the whole church. I've seen churches divided over a couple that end up divorced. And you have people on his team, people on her team, all of those kinds of things, and that's the division of marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Who's right, who's wrong, and the challenges and charges that get thrown back and forth and on and on and on. God doesn't hate you. God loves the sinner. God loves the downtrodden. If you're divorced and didn't sin, you did nothing to contribute to it. God loves you, but you're still hurting. And God wants you to be an overcomer. God doesn't want you to live the rest of your life as a victim. He wants you to know that there is a what now? There is a morning after. There is the rest of my life. And the rest of my life can be John 10:10. He wants me to live in abundance. If we fear that we're going to normalize it by talking about it. If we talk about it, then it seems like we accept it. And the truth is, we accept that people get divorced. Because they do. John said, write these things so you don't sin, but I accept that some of you are going to sin. And if you do, you have an advocate with the Father. It'd be like saying, if we study coronavirus, it's just going to make it more rampant. No, it's going to help us to understand it and thereby cure it. And I think that's what we need to do with the topic of divorce, is every one of us needs to understand it. We need to understand what leads to it. We need to understand how we can prevent it. But we can't do that without talking about it, to discussing it. And the purpose of this lesson is not to cure anything. It's to try to encourage us to begin to openly discuss the reality that is impacting every one of us in one way or another. I want you to know that you're not alone. Your voice is not silent. We're trying to deal with a tough reality just like you are. Be patient with us. I also want to challenge us that denial is the number one way we deal with it. The elder in Broken Bow was denying a reality that all it took was one question to see the reality. And he was denying that. He was denying it because unwittingly they had created an environment of not talking about it. And guys, there are so many topics in Christianity, we can talk for the rest of our lives and never talk about it. We can avoid it very easily, but That's going to leave a lot of devastating, hurting people. You know, I've had people come to me in the past, hey, my husband and I, we're about to have to file for bankruptcy. Mary, just 6 months ago, we had a whole series on Christian finances and how to be free from the burdens and all of those. Why didn't you come? Well, and the truth is, because I wasn't in crisis then, or I was in crisis, just didn't realize how much. The word prevention literally means to come before. It's to do something before, or to face something before you actually get into the event. Since so many marriages end in divorce, so many marriages at Fort Gibson, so many marriages in the Fort Gibson Church of Christ end in divorce, shouldn't we prepare for the best and the worst? Shouldn't we talk about the unspeakable? Now, just your personal perspective. I want to ask you the same question I want to ask you your perspective. If we were to ask, next time we get together as a group, we're all in the auditorium, and I ask the question, how many of you have been impacted either directly yourself or someone in your family? You've been impacted by divorce. Raise your hand. How many people do you believe would raise their hands? Now, compare that with Broken Bow, where they didn't think they had a problem until they raised their hands. Now, the next question is, if you think that would be several, many, majority, a whole bunch, do you think we need to talk about it? Do you think we need to deal with that? Do you think we need to have some open discussions of preparation of how to deal with it? And do we need to have some open discussions of, now what do we do that someone's in that situation? And that's the psychology of it, as well as the theology of it. We got hurting brethren. And a lot of times they don't feel like they can talk, or there's not an avenue, there's not a place for them to raise their issues, etc. So I'm going to make some proposals, and I would like to get some feedback, because am I the one, like at that retreat, am I the one talking about something that nobody else feels comfortable talking about? Do we need a Bible class on divorce? Not the theology of it. Now, let me just preempt that. Do we need a discussion about the theology of divorce? But do we need a discussion about the emotional, psychological, spiritual impact of divorce, the reality of divorce, and how we can best minister to those who are going through it, who've gone through it, etc.? Should we have after divorce support groups? Should we have a place, as indicated, a need indicated, should we have a place that people can go and talk about the challenges? And I'm not talking about necessarily just when they're going through a divorce, but what about the months after? What about the years after? Because you get into it all of the ways, it's like pulling the layers off an onion of all the ways that it impacts that we didn't even anticipate. Should we have some preventive teaching to our young people? A realistic look into the lives of divorced people. What's it like to go through a divorce? What does divorce do to people? For instance, the number one way that people are introduced into poverty in the United States right now is through divorce, and the majority of those are women. Should we talk about that? Now, some people don't want to talk about it because it seems disempowering to women. It's the lack of information, it's the lack of truth that's disempowering to women. The reality doesn't change, and the reality is more people are introduced, more people will be introduced to poverty through divorce, even this year, even with the coronavirus, than those who are working through it together, families that stay together, etc. Do we need divorce outreach to the community? Is it time to get some discussion started? Should we have connect group discussions, not necessarily a whole quarter? Should we have some connect group discussions about divorce and the reality of divorce? Should we have some connect groups just for divorced people to share their challenges? I would really like some impact. What I want to do with this lesson is raise the subject, separate the theology, which is elders' work, from the ministry, which is our work. We don't decide who is right or wrong. We don't decide who is we can fellowship or disfellowship. That's their responsibility. That's why they're older men. That's why the maturity and the wisdom that comes with their age and experience and all of those, that's why it's so important. And until they tell us that, then what we do is just minister. Now, when they say this person has violated the teachings of God and have turned their back on the teachings of God and are not willing to repent, not willing to change, so we need to go through this process of Matthew chapter 18. When they do that, that's the application of the theology. Other than that, can we take that out of the discussion as the inhibitor to us helping anybody? Because we don't want to be right. We don't want to be wrong. We don't want to minister to the wrong person and become twice the son of hell as somebody who's rejected God. But that keeps us in neutral. That keeps us not talking. That keeps the ministry from happening. And is it a problem? Is it a problem that's impacting us directly, indirectly? Is it a problem that's impacting your family? Do we need to have some discussions? Give me some feedback. I've addressed the elephant in the room. Now that I've addressed it, shall we go back to ignoring the elephant? Or shall we address the elephant, deal with the elephant, and help those who desperately need ministry? God bless you. I know this is not a comfortable discussion. I understand that. Nothing having to do with sin and destruction is. My question is not, is it comfortable? My question is it necessary? Is it desirous? Is it needed here among us? And if so, what are we going to do? Give me some feedback. Let's get a discussion going, even just me and you. What do we do now? Where do we go from here? God bless you. Have a great week.